I never thought a single night at the restaurant would change my life forever. But if I had known what was waiting for me, I would have looked at every detail differently. I had no idea that behind the face of an ordinary customer, destiny was preparing to reveal itself in the most shocking way possible. I never thought a single night at the restaurant would change my life forever. Yet as I look back now, every detail of that shift feels carved into my memory, as though fate itself had scripted it. For most people, waiting tables is just a job they take for a while, until something better comes along. But for me, it had become the thin thread holding my life together. I was not a man with choices or privileges. I was a man caught in survival, trying to stretch every coin to feed my family, to pay off debts that never seemed to shrink, to keep alive a dream that felt more distant with every passing day. My day usually began before sunrise and ended long past midnight. On that particular night, my body carried the weight of exhaustion heavier than ever before. Yet I kept moving because stopping was not an option. The restaurant where I worked was not just a place of employment. It was a stage where the gap between rich and poor was put on cruel display every single evening. The chandeliers sparkled above tables dressed in white cloth, and glasses of wine shimmered like liquid jewels in the warm glow of golden lights. Customers laughed and indulged in dishes so expensive that one plate could equal my entire week's wage. I moved quietly between them, unseen, unheard, as though I was just part of the furniture meant to serve, not to exist. Behind my polite smile and respectful nods, hunger gnawed at my stomach and fatigue pressed down on my shoulders. My feet ached from standing too long. But when I thought about my younger siblings waiting at home, about my mother who had grown old before her time because life had beaten her mercilessly, I forced myself to straighten my back and keep going. Every coin I earned mattered. Every tip, no matter how small, could mean bread, rice, or medicine. The wealthy guests at the tables never noticed the tremor in my hands as I poured their drinks, nor did they care about the way my heart raced whenever I thought of bills waiting to be paid. To them, I was invisible, and maybe that was easier for them. Seeing me as a shadow meant they didn't have to acknowledge the life behind my uniform. But inside me, a storm of emotions brewed. I carried dreams that I never dared to voice aloud. I imagined a life where I could walk into a restaurant not as a server, but as a guest. A life where I could afford to sit, laugh, and taste the very things I only carried to other people's tables. Yet every night, as I collected dirty dishes and wiped down stained napkins, that dream felt like a cruel fantasy. Still, I held on to it, because letting go would mean admitting that this was all my life would ever be, and I refused to surrender completely, even if hope burned faintly like the smallest candle in a storm. That night was no different, or so I believed. The air was filled with the usual blend of expensive perfumes, the clinking of silverware, and the low hum of conversations about business deals, vacations, and luxuries I could not even imagine. Couples laughed over fine wine, businessmen bragged about profits, and I moved from table to table, unnoticed by all but the demanding calls of "waiter" echoing in the air. Each word felt less like a request and more like a command, a reminder of where I stood in this world. My manager, a man who measured worth only in profits and appearances, hovered constantly, ready to scold me if a glass wasn't polished enough or if a dish took too long to arrive. I had grown used to swallowing humiliation with the same ease I carried trays, because answering back would mean risking my job, and losing my job would mean losing everything. My coworkers often whispered complaints, but I remained silent, burying every insult deep inside me, because my family's survival weighed more than my pride. Still, my mind wandered in quiet moments. I thought of my father, who had once worked tirelessly just as I did until illness claimed him. leaving us with nothing but debts and broken memories. I thought of my siblings, whose eyes carried the same hunger mine did, whose futures I desperately wanted to protect, even though I had no idea how. Each thought was a dagger in my chest, but also the fuel that kept me moving from one table to the next, smiling when I wanted to cry, bowing when I wanted to scream. It was in the middle of this endless rhythm of serving and surviving that I felt something shift in the air that night. I couldn't explain it then, but looking back, I realize it was the subtle hand of destiny weaving its threads through my exhaustion. While I wiped down a table abandoned by careless guests who had left crumbs scattered like insults, a strange feeling crept over me. Something unusual was about to happen. The kind of night that begins as ordinary but etches itself into your life forever. At the time, I had no reason to believe it. To me, it was just another long shift stretching ahead, another night where I would collapse into bed with sore muscles and empty pockets. Yet as I balanced a tray of glasses and looked around the dining hall, the laughter of the wealthy echoing in my ears, I felt the faintest shiver run down my spine. I told myself it was just fatigue, just another trick my tired mind was playing on me. But deep inside, a whisper of intuition told me that my life, which had trudged on in shadows for so long, was about to collide with something far greater than I could ever imagine. And as I carried myself toward the next table, unaware of who I was about to serve, I couldn't have known that this ordinary-looking man was, in fact, a billionaire in disguise, the very person who would change the course of my destiny forever. He didn't look like anyone special. At least, that's what I thought in the first fleeting glance. If I had known the truth hidden behind those simple clothes and that calm demeanor, my hands would have trembled, and my heart would have raced with fear and awe. But in that moment, to me, he was just another guest. One more face in the endless sea of strangers I served every night. It was late in the evening when he entered, and at first I barely noticed him. The restaurant was already alive with its usual chaos, the chime of cutlery striking plates, the bursts of laughter echoing from tables where businessmen bragged about their triumphs, the rustle of expensive silk dresses brushing against polished chairs. Guests arrived in their usual manner, wrapped in arrogance as though wealth itself had stitched their garments, demanding attention before even settling into their seats. I had grown so accustomed to the spectacle that I could predict the rhythm of the night just by the tone of their footsteps. Yet this man was different. He walked in without the weight of pride that others carried. His clothes were simple, almost too ordinary for a place like ours. A plain shirt, neatly pressed but without the shimmer of branded logos, and trousers that looked comfortable rather than tailored. He wore no flashy accessories, no gold chains or diamond-studded watches that the rich often displayed like trophies. Even his shoes were unremarkable, polished but not expensive. If anything, he looked like someone who belonged outside the glowing doors of this place, rather than within them. And yet there he was, stepping across the marble floor with a calmness that drew my attention. There was something strange in his demeanor. Not arrogance, not pride, but a quiet confidence that almost felt misplaced among the loudness of wealth. While others walked in as though the world owed them a throne, he walked in as if he owed nothing to anyone. His eyes, calm and observant, swept across the room not to claim it, but to understand it. And though his face carried no sign of recognition, there was an undeniable depth in his gaze, as though he knew far more than he revealed. He ignored the tables that demanded to be noticed, the ones bathed in light at the center of the hall where the wealthiest sat to ensure they were seen. Instead, he moved toward a quiet corner near the window, a place where shadows softened the glow of chandeliers and the outside world peeked in through glass panes. Most wealthy guests fought for the central spots, eager to be admired by strangers. Yet he sought solitude, turning his back to the stage where vanity played out each night. He did not call for the manager, did not snap his fingers, did not make any display of superiority. He simply sat down, his movements deliberate, unhurried, almost as though he had all the time in the world. At first I paid him little attention. To me, he seemed like someone who had wandered into the wrong place, a man of modest means who would quietly order a meal, eat, and leave without leaving behind much of a memory. The wealthy elite who filled our tables were easy to identify. They dripped with extravagance and wore superiority like a crown, but he seemed stripped of all that. There was nothing about him that screamed power, nothing that warned me that I should treat him differently. I approached his table with the same professionalism I offered every guest, though inside I felt relief that he did not appear demanding like the others. Perhaps, I thought, this man would not call me endlessly, would not complain about trivial details, would not toss coins at me as though they were doing me a favor. His presence seemed easier, calmer, and for a brief moment it felt refreshing to serve someone who didn't carry arrogance like a second skin. Still, as I stood near him, I couldn't shake the faint feeling that something was out of place. The calmness with which he carried himself was not born of weakness, nor was it the quiet submission of someone overwhelmed by wealth. It was something else entirely, a self-assurance that did not need to be spoken aloud. When our eyes met briefly, I felt a strange unease, as though I was standing in front of a man who saw me more clearly than I saw him. But I brushed the thought away quickly. After all, I was just a waiter, and he was just another customer, or so I believed. The contrast between him and the others in the hall grew sharper with every passing second. While men in tailored suits raised their voices to boast about their latest deals, he remained silent, almost blending into the background. While women draped in jewels laughed in exaggerated tones, he sat with quiet composure, as though the noise around him could not touch the stillness within him. Where others demanded to be noticed, he seemed to prefer invisibility. As I placed a glass of water before him, I noticed that his hands were steady, his posture relaxed, and his gaze fixed not on the room, but on the view outside the window. It was almost as if he had come not for the food or the company, but for a moment of solitude amidst chaos. That in itself was unusual, because people did not come to this place for peace. They came to flaunt their wealth and feed their egos. Yet here was a man who seemed to find more satisfaction in silence than in extravagance. I remember telling myself not to overthink it. Guests came in all forms, and perhaps he was simply a man who valued quiet. Perhaps he was someone passing through, a traveler who cared little for appearances. My life had no space for curiosity about strangers. My focus had to remain on survival, on earning enough to scrape through another day. So I told myself he was just another customer, no more important than the dozens I had already served that night. And yet, even as I tried to convince myself, my instincts whispered otherwise. Something about him did not fit. He did not belong in the category of ordinary, no matter how plain his clothes or how quiet his demeanor. There was a presence about him that I could not explain, a weight in the air around his table that made me hesitate for just a moment longer than usual before walking away. At that time, I dismissed the thought and carried on with my work, never realizing that this man, who looked so unremarkable and ordinary, was in truth a billionaire in disguise. But little did I know, appearances can be dangerously deceiving, and the choice to treat him as just another guest would soon alter the entire course of my life. Even when tired, I believed in serving with sincerity, because deep inside I knew that if I lost my integrity in this endless struggle, then I would lose the last thing that kept me human. When I approached his table, tray balanced carefully in my weary hands, I tried to carry myself with the same politeness I offered to every guest. The exhaustion inside me was heavy, dragging at every muscle, whispering that I should just collapse into a chair and give up for the night. But I couldn't. My livelihood depended on the way I treated these people. One mistake, one complaint, one sign of carelessness, and I could lose my job in an instant, and with it, the fragile stability I fought so hard to protect for my family. So I straightened my back, forced a smile to soften the lines of fatigue around my mouth, and spoke with the kind of respect that felt almost unnatural, considering how invisible I usually was to the people I served. He looked up at me, and for the first time that evening, I felt the weight of his eyes settle on me, not with the harshness of someone scrutinizing a servant, but with the curiosity of someone who saw beyond the uniform. It unsettled me in a way I could not explain, yet I held my composure and asked softly if he had made a decision about his meal. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried none of the arrogance I braced myself for. It was calm, steady, almost too kind for a place like this. He ordered simply, not the extravagant dishes that most of our wealthy clients demanded, but something modest, something that did not require a grand performance from the kitchen. As I scribbled his order onto my notepad, I couldn't help but notice the way he paused, watching me closely, as though measuring not just my words, but my effort, my sincerity, even the heaviness in my movements. Most guests barely looked at me. I was just the middleman between their desire and their plate. Yet here was a man who not only noticed me, but seemed to see me. It was disarming, and I found myself wondering why his gaze carried such weight when he seemed, by every measure of appearance, so ordinary. I returned his menu with both hands, a gesture of respect I had learned to maintain no matter how tired I was. He nodded slightly, a small acknowledgement that felt strangely significant. Then, as I turned to walk away, my body screamed with pain from hours of moving between tables. My legs felt like they might buckle, my shoulders burned from carrying heavy trays, and my head throbbed with the lingering echo of clinking glasses and constant chatter. In that moment, I longed desperately for a different life, one where I didn't have to hide my pain behind politeness, where I could rest without the constant fear of not earning enough, where I could breathe without the weight of endless responsibility crushing me. But dreams, no matter how vivid, do not pay bills, and so I forced them back into the locked corner of my mind. Instead, I let the mask of professionalism stay in place, because that mask was the only thing keeping me employed. Still, inside me, a quiet voice whispered that perhaps one day, somehow, life could be different. Perhaps my kindness and honesty were not wasted, even if no one else cared to see them. When I returned to his table with his drink, I placed it gently before him, careful not to let the glass clink too loudly against the wood. I offered a polite smile and asked if there was anything else he might need while he waited for his meal. He studied me for a moment, before shaking his head with that same calm composure, and though no words passed between us, I felt as though a silent conversation was taking place. Unlike others who dismissed my presence as background noise, he acknowledged my effort with every glance, and in that acknowledgement, I felt something stir inside me, a mixture of gratitude and unease, because I wasn't used to being seen in this way. As the evening wore on, I continued with my duties, weaving between tables, enduring the sharp commands of other guests, swallowing insults that came disguised as jokes. But each time I returned to his table, I felt a shift. He never raised his voice, never demanded, never looked at me as if I was beneath him. Instead, he treated me with a quiet respect that unsettled me more than cruelty ever could. Cruelty I understood. It was expected, predictable, something I had learned to brace myself against. But respect, genuine respect, was rare, almost alien in this place, and it made me wonder who he really was. Inside my head, a storm brewed. Why was I so affected by a man who looked so ordinary? Why did his simple gestures make me question the life I had accepted as unchangeable? I longed to escape the cycle of endless shifts, to rise above the world that had trapped me. But each night I returned home with nothing but exhaustion, and each morning I returned to the same grind. And yet, here was a stranger whose quiet recognition of my sincerity made me feel, even if only for a moment, that my honesty mattered. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself that it was just another night, just another customer, nothing more. But deep inside, I felt the faint stirrings of something I could not yet name. There was a reason his presence unsettled me, a reason my heart beat faster each time I approached his table. It wasn't attraction, nor was it fear. It was something far more complicated, a feeling that my life was standing at the edge of a turning point I could not yet see. The more I tried to focus on my tasks, the more distracted I became by the weight of that realization. For years, I had told myself that sincerity meant nothing in a world ruled by money, that kindness was invisible in the eyes of those blinded by wealth. Yet this man noticed. He noticed the effort behind my tired smile, the respect in my gestures, the honesty in the way I served despite my pain. And in noticing, he gave me something no tip, no salary, no word of praise from my manager ever could. He gave me the feeling of being valued as a human being. But just as I began to grow comfortable in the quiet rhythm of serving him, he did something completely unexpected, something that would throw me off balance and force me to question everything I thought I knew about this night, and about him. Sometimes the truth hides in plain sight, so close that if you let your eyes slip for even a moment, you miss it entirely. And I realize now that on that night, I missed signs so obvious that they should have screamed the truth to me, but instead they melted into the fog of my exhaustion and slipped past unnoticed. When I returned to his table with his order, I was focused on balancing the tray and maintaining the polite mask that had become second nature to me. My mind was too cluttered with worries about tips, rent, and the long list of responsibilities waiting outside those shining doors to see clearly. And yet, even through the blur of fatigue, there were details about him that stood out, details that I failed to put together into the picture they should have painted. The first thing I should have noticed was his watch. At a glance, it was sleek, refined, and so discreet that it could easily pass for just another accessory. But as I leaned forward to set down his plate, I caught the glint of its face beneath the warm chandelier light, and something about it struck me as odd. I had seen many wealthy men flaunt watches encrusted with jewels, oversized dials designed to scream power and wealth. Yet his was different. It was understated, subtle, but in that subtlety was its true value. The craftsmanship was undeniable, the kind of precision and elegance that I knew could only come from the most expensive brands in the world. A single glance should have told me that the piece on his wrist cost more than I could earn in years of serving tables. But I dismissed it, convincing myself that perhaps it was just a gifted item, or maybe even a well-made imitation. After all, what reason would a man of such wealth have to sit quietly in a place like ours? Then, there was his choice of meal. He had ordered something modest, a dish most of our guests would never even look at, preferring instead the most elaborate and expensive options the menu had to offer. But the way he ordered it, without hesitation, without asking for substitutions or alterations like so many others did, told me that he knew exactly what he wanted. There was no attempt to impress, no performance of extravagance, and that in itself was unusual. Most wealthy men seemed to crave attention, needing every action to confirm their superiority. Yet here he was, choosing a meal so simple that it almost clashed with the confidence he carried. And it was that confidence that unsettled me the most, even if I did not realize it in the moment. He moved with the calm assurance of someone who had nothing to prove, no one to impress. His posture was relaxed, his voice steady, his presence commanding without ever trying to dominate. It was a kind of quiet strength I had rarely seen in this restaurant, where men and women cloaked themselves in arrogance to disguise their insecurities. His calmness wasn't born of timidity. It was born of certainty, the kind of certainty that comes only from a life where nothing is out of reach. But in my tired state, I convinced myself that I was overthinking. My body was aching, my mind clouded with fatigue, and I didn't have the energy to dwell on oddities. To me, he was still just another man passing through. I reminded myself that rich men did not eat unnoticed in restaurants like ours. Wealthy people came here to be seen, to flaunt their riches, to draw eyes toward them like moths to a flame. This man sitting quietly in the corner, dressed in ordinary clothes and ordering a modest meal, simply did not fit the image. And so I told myself he couldn't possibly belong to that world. Every time I returned to his table, though, I felt that faint unease pressing at me, as though my instincts were screaming something my mind refused to hear. His eyes followed the room in a way that wasn't idle curiosity. He observed, studied, and seemed to read the people around him as though they were open books. I caught him once glancing at a group of businessmen who were loudly boasting about a deal, and in his faint smile I sensed not amusement, but knowledge. Knowledge of things I could not understand, as if he had seen it all before. I should have stopped to think, should have asked myself why a man so composed, so quietly self-assured, would sit in a place like this without drawing attention. I should have pieced together the watch, the demeanor, the subtle confidence that leaked from every movement. But the weight of exhaustion dulled my senses, and I convinced myself that it was nothing. My mind whispered excuses, telling me he was perhaps a professor or a traveler or a man of modest means who simply carried himself with dignity. After all, it was easier to believe in ordinary explanations than to face the possibility of something extraordinary sitting quietly before me. As the night wore on, the restaurant swelled with noise, laughter echoing from the grand tables, and I sank deeper into the routine I knew too well. Refilling glasses, clearing plates, bowing politely to those who barely spared me a glance. And yet every time I walked past his table, my eyes strayed for just a second too long, as though drawn by an invisible thread. He seemed so out of place and yet so perfectly composed within it, and I could not explain why. Looking back, I realized that the signs were everywhere. His clothes may have been plain, but their quality was undeniable. The stitching, the fit, the quiet elegance spoke of a tailor's hand, not a factory machine. His shoes, while not flashy, were the kind of leather that never lies, smooth and rich, built to last decades rather than months. Even the way he held his fork, with precise and effortless grace, should have told me that he was no stranger to the world of fine dining. But at the time, I was too blinded by my own exhaustion to see the truth staring me in the face. I ignored it all. The watch, the meal, the confidence, the quiet power that clung to him like a second skin, because believing otherwise would have shattered the fragile rhythm I clung to. To acknowledge that someone extraordinary was sitting there, quietly watching me, would have forced me to step out of the invisibility I had grown so used to, and I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. But fate does not wait for readiness. And as I busied myself with trays and glasses, dismissing the clues that surrounded me, I had no idea that each detail I ignored was leading me closer to a revelation so shocking that I would soon regret not paying more attention. For the first time, a customer wanted to hear my story, not because he was curious in the shallow way most wealthy guests asked meaningless questions, but because his eyes carried a depth that told me he genuinely wanted to know who I was. And that small act of interest pierced through the walls of silence I had built around myself for years. It began so unexpectedly that at first I thought I had misheard him. I had just returned to his table to check if everything was satisfactory, rehearsing the usual lines I spoke out of habit, expecting nothing more than a polite nod or a dismissive wave of the hand. Instead, he looked up at me with an expression that was neither commanding nor indifferent, but warm, almost inviting. and he asked me a question no one in that place had ever asked before. "You work very hard," he said quietly, his voice steady but gentle. "But why? What is it that drives you every day?" For a moment, I stood frozen, unsure how to respond. Guests never asked me about my life. They asked for extra wine, for more bread, for their plates to be cleared faster. They asked for discounts they didn't need, for favors they didn't deserve, for attention they demanded like children throwing tantrums. But never had anyone looked at me with such calm seriousness and asked about the person behind the uniform. I laughed nervously, trying to deflect, but his gaze did not waver. It wasn't the kind of gaze that intruded or judged. It was the gaze of someone who actually cared, someone who wanted to listen. And for reasons I still can't fully explain, the walls I usually kept so carefully intact began to crack. I told him the truth. I told him about my family, about how my father's illness had drained us of everything we once had, about how my mother had aged too quickly from carrying burdens she should never have faced alone. I spoke of my younger siblings, of their bright eyes and fragile dreams, and of my desperate determination to make sure they never had to feel the weight of despair the way I did. I explained how every coin I earned went not toward luxuries for myself, but toward school fees, groceries, rent, and medicine. As I spoke, I realized how rarely I allowed myself to say these words aloud. Most nights, I buried them beneath forced smiles and polite nods. But here, in front of a man I knew nothing about, the truth flowed out of me as though it had been waiting for someone to receive it. And the most astonishing part was that he listened. Not the way people sometimes pretend to listen, with distracted nods and half-hearted murmurs, but truly listened. His eyes stayed fixed on mine, steady, calm, attentive, as though every word I spoke mattered deeply to him. I admitted things I rarely allowed myself to think, let alone speak. I told him about my exhaustion, about the nights I stumbled home with aching legs and an empty stomach, about the dreams I carried silently, dreams of a different life, dreams of studying, of building something meaningful, of living without this constant fear of collapse. I confessed how trapped I felt, caught in a cycle where hard work barely kept me afloat, and how sometimes I wondered if all my effort even made a difference. The more I spoke, the lighter I felt, though my chest also ached with a vulnerability I wasn't used to. I expected him to interrupt, to dismiss me, to offer some meaningless platitude. But he didn't. He leaned slightly forward, his chin resting gently on his hand, and he gave me his full attention. It was so unusual, so unsettling, that I almost faltered, questioning why I was pouring out my soul to a stranger. But something about him made me feel safe, as though he carried a presence that absorbed the weight of my pain without judgment. It wasn't pity I saw in his eyes, but understanding that came not from reading about struggle in books, but from having lived through it in some form himself. That thought both comforted and confused me. Who was this man, dressed so simply, sitting so quietly, who could make me feel more seen than anyone else in my life ever had? When I finally fell silent, embarrassed by how much I had revealed, I tried to apologize for speaking too much. "I'm sorry," I muttered, lowering my gaze. "I don't usually talk like this. It's just, you asked." I expected him to smile politely and move on, to treat my confession as nothing more than a curious distraction. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the weight of every word I had spoken. "You shouldn't apologize for honesty," he said quietly, his voice steady, carrying an authority that felt both comforting and commanding. "Most people spend their whole lives hiding behind masks, but you keep going, even when it costs you everything. That is not weakness, that is strength." His words struck me with a force I hadn't expected. Strength. No one had ever described me that way before. To most people, I was just a poor waiter scraping by, invisible, insignificant. But here was this man telling me that my struggle, my resilience, was something powerful. I didn't know how to respond. My throat tightened, and I felt a warmth rise behind my eyes. But I forced myself to keep the tears at bay. I found myself studying him more closely then. His face was calm, but there was a depth in his eyes that unsettled me. He seemed to understand too much, as though he was not hearing my story for the first time, but rather recognizing something he already knew. He carried himself like a man who had faced storms of his own, yet stood taller because of them. It made me wonder if beneath his simple appearance there was a story just as complex, just as heavy as mine. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, filled with unspoken meaning. And in that silence, my mind raced with questions I dared not ask. Why had he cared enough to listen? Why had he asked in the first place? And why did I feel that this conversation, though brief, had shifted something inside me? I was about to collect myself and move on, treating him like just another guest, when he leaned back slightly, his eyes holding mine with quiet intensity. And the words that came from his mouth made me realize that he was no ordinary diner at all. I didn't know I was being tested, and had I realized in that very moment that every move I made was under a silent judgment, I would have felt the weight of the world pressing down on my chest. Instead, I acted on instinct, not knowing that this simple choice would become one of the most important decisions of my life. The evening had stretched long, my body aching from the endless rhythm of carrying trays, clearing tables, and bowing to demands. Yet when I returned to his corner table, there was something oddly still about the space. His meal had been finished, the plate half pushed aside, and he seemed lost in thought, staring at the glass of water before him as though it contained secrets only he could decipher. I stepped closer, preparing to clear the table, when something caught my eye near the edge of the chair. It was his wallet. At first I thought perhaps it had slipped accidentally as he shifted in his seat, but when I bent to pick it up, the sheer weight of it startled me. The leather was soft, expensive in a way you could feel without knowing brands. And when it opened, slightly in my hand, I saw what no man in my position ever expected to see: wads of crisp bills stuffed inside, more cash than I had ever held in my life. The sight of it made my heart stutter violently in my chest, my palms suddenly damp with a nervous sweat. For a fleeting second, a dangerous thought flickered across my mind. With that amount of money, I could pay off months of rent, buy food without counting every coin, maybe even save enough to give my siblings the kind of life they deserved. That wallet was heavy with possibilities, each note whispering promises of relief, freedom, and comfort I had long been denied. I could almost see my mother's weary face light up if I came home with even a fraction of what lay inside. But the thought passed as quickly as it came, smothered beneath the weight of something stronger than desperation: my integrity. I knew too well the taste of poverty, the suffocating grip of need. But I also knew that to betray honesty, even for survival, would be to lose the last piece of myself I still clung to. The temptation had flared, yes, but it was never an option. Without hesitation, I closed the wallet, tightened my grip to ensure it wouldn't slip again, and leaned forward to place it carefully on the table before him. "Sir, you dropped this," I said softly, my voice steadier than I felt. He looked up slowly, his eyes meeting mine, and for the briefest moment I thought I saw something flicker there. A glint of surprise, then something deeper, something like quiet satisfaction. He took the wallet back without a word, only a faint nod of acknowledgement, but the silence carried more weight than any spoken gratitude could. His gaze lingered on me for a moment longer than necessary, as though he were searching for something, studying not just my actions but the essence of who I was. I turned away quickly, embarrassed by the heat rising in my face, and told myself it was nothing. Guests left things behind all the time, scarves, pens, even wallets, and returning them was simply part of the job. Honesty wasn't something extraordinary. It was expected, and I had no reason to think this moment was anything more than routine. To me, it was just another act of decency, another quiet choice to hold on to what little dignity I had left. And yet, deep down, I couldn't shake the strange heaviness of his silence. Why had he looked at me that way? Why had his eyes carried such intensity, as though the act of returning a wallet was something far greater than it seemed? I tried to dismiss the thought, focusing instead on the growing demands of other tables, the clatter of dishes, and the barked orders from the kitchen. But the memory of his gaze lingered, replaying in my mind even as I forced myself back into the rhythm of the shift. Hours later, when I reflected on it, I realized that it hadn't been an accident at all. He hadn't dropped the wallet carelessly. It had been deliberate, a quiet test cloaked as coincidence, a way to measure the man who stood before him in a uniform worn thin by struggle. He had wanted to see what I would do, to peer into the core of my being without asking a single question, and in that moment, without knowing it, I had been weighed and measured. If I had chosen differently, if I had let greed cloud my honesty, if I had slipped even a single bill into my pocket, I would have failed a test I never knew I was taking. My entire future, though invisible to me then, had hung in the balance of that small decision. It was terrifying to realize later how fragile the line was between the life I had and the life I could have lost. But at the time, I carried on as though nothing had happened. I convinced myself it was ordinary, that I had done only what was right and nothing more. My integrity had been instinct, not performance, and I thought no more of it. Yet I did not see the way he watched me afterward, the quiet admiration in his eyes, the way he seemed to regard me differently than before. His silence was not emptiness, it was recognition. Recognition of something I didn't even know I had proven. As I moved between tables, I felt a strange unease growing in me. Why had he not thanked me properly? Why had he only nodded, as though words would somehow betray what he was truly thinking? The questions gnawed at me, but I buried them under the exhaustion of work, telling myself I was imagining things. Looking back now, I understand that night was not ordinary. It was not routine. It was the moment my honesty was seen by the wrong, or perhaps the right person, and the consequences of that single act would ripple through my life in ways I could never have predicted. And to the time, I brushed it aside as nothing more than a forgettable moment. But what I didn't know was that my honesty had been marked, noted, and stored away. And soon enough, I would discover that the man I thought was ordinary had been silently testing me all along, and my life was about to change because of it. He left as mysteriously as he arrived, as though the quiet stranger who had unsettled my heart and stirred my thoughts was nothing more than a passing shadow in the grand hall of the restaurant. But I had no idea that his departure would leave behind a mark far deeper than his presence ever had. The evening had begun to slow, the chaos of clinking glasses and bursts of laughter gradually softening as guests finished their meals and prepared to leave. My body ached, my mind heavy with the exhaustion of countless hours on my feet. And yet, when I glanced toward the corner table where he sat, I felt a strange sharpness return to my awareness. He had finished his meal long ago, yet he lingered, sipping water with the calm patience of someone who carried no rush, no pressing obligation waiting outside those doors. There was something about that patience that made him stand out even more, because in a place where everyone demanded speed, he seemed content to move at his own pace, as if time itself belonged to him. I approached his table one last time, preparing myself for the usual polite exchange that came at the end of service. Yet, instead of demanding the bill or waving me off with the dismissiveness I had grown accustomed to, he looked at me with that same quiet steadiness, and for the first time that night, a faint smile touched his lips. It wasn't the arrogant smile of a wealthy man who believed kindness was a performance, nor was it the distracted smile of someone eager to leave. It was genuine, warm, and so unexpected that for a moment I almost forgot to breathe. "Thank you," he said simply. 2 words spoken softly, but in them was a sincerity that carried more weight than any lavish praise I had ever received. Most customers threw thanks casually, often laced with condescension, but his voice was different, steady, deliberate, almost reverent, as though he truly meant it. Then, before I could respond, he reached into his pocket, withdrew a small stack of bills, and placed them neatly beneath the edge of the plate. At first, I assumed it was a modest tip, though perhaps larger than the usual coins or small notes I often received. But when he rose from his chair and walked toward the door with that same calm composure, curiosity got the better of me. I leaned forward, lifting the bills discreetly, and my heart nearly stopped. It was more than I had ever seen left on a table. Not just generous, not just kind, but staggering. An amount so absurd that for a brief second, I thought my eyes were deceiving me. The bills felt heavy in my hand, each one a reminder of the impossibility of what I was holding. A single night's tip from this man equaled months of my hard work, months of exhaustion, months of sacrificing every piece of myself just to survive. My knees trembled as I held it, unsure whether to be grateful, confused, or frightened by the sheer magnitude of his gesture. Why? The question screamed in my mind, louder than the fading sounds of laughter and chatter around me. Why would a man dressed so simply, eating so modestly, leave behind something so extravagant? I had served countless wealthy people before, people dripping in jewels and pride, but never had any of them shown such generosity. Most barely noticed me. Most treated me like an inconvenience. And yet here was a stranger who not only noticed me, but chose to give me something that felt impossibly beyond reason. I hurried toward the entrance, hoping to catch him before he disappeared, my hands trembling as I clutched the money, unsure whether to return it, to question it, or to simply thank him for a kindness I did not feel I deserved. But just as I reached the doorway, I saw him turn back slightly, his eyes meeting mine across the distance. That faint smile returned, and with it came words that have echoed in my mind ever since. "I'll see you soon," he said softly, his voice carrying easily through the hum of the room. And then he was gone, vanishing into the night as quietly as he had arrived, leaving behind not just the money, not just the shock, but a storm of questions that refused to settle in my heart. I stood frozen for what felt like minutes, staring at the door as though it might open again, as though he might step back inside and explain who he was, why he had done what he did, and what his words truly meant. But the door remained closed, and the night carried on as though nothing extraordinary had happened, though I knew in my bones that something had. I returned to his table, still trembling, staring at the bills as though they were cursed. Gratitude warred with suspicion inside me. Part of me wanted to rejoice, to think of the food I could buy, the debts I could pay, the small relief this money could bring to my family. But another part of me couldn't silence the unease, the feeling that this was not ordinary generosity, that his gift carried with it a meaning I could not yet see. Why me? Why tonight? Why such a sum that seemed more like a message than a tip? As the restaurant emptied and the night drew to a close, I found myself unable to focus on anything else. His presence lingered in the air like a ghost, his words repeating in my ears until they carved themselves into my memory. "I'll see you soon." It was a promise, not a farewell. And though I didn't understand it, I felt the truth of it deep within me. He would return. And when he did, my life would not be the same. I went home that night, clutching the money, my heart heavy with gratitude and fear, unable to shake the haunting question that gnawed at me with every breath. Who was he, really? Sometimes the mind refuses to sleep when questions remain unanswered. And though my body ached with the exhaustion of another endless shift, my thoughts were wide awake, burning with confusion and curiosity about the stranger who had walked into my life and left behind far more than just money. By the time I left the restaurant that night, the streets outside were quiet, the lamps casting pale circles of light on the worn pavement. But inside my chest, there was no stillness. I walked home with the weight of the money tucked carefully into my pocket, yet it felt heavier than any tray I had carried all evening, as though each bill pressed against me with 1,000 unspoken questions. The night air was cool, carrying with it the faint scent of rain, but it did nothing to calm the storm in my head. Every step echoed with doubt, gratitude, and suspicion tangled together so tightly I could not separate one from the other. When I reached home, my family was still awake, my mother sitting at the small wooden table sorting through old bills with tired eyes, my siblings huddled nearby with their school books spread out, pretending to study though their eyelids drooped with fatigue. They looked up when I entered, their faces lighting with the fragile hope they carried every time I returned from work, as if I might bring with me some miracle that would lift us out of our struggle. I smiled faintly to reassure them, but inside I was unraveling. I placed the money carefully on the table, my hands trembling slightly as I did so, and immediately my mother's eyes widened in disbelief. "Where did this come from?" she asked, her voice trembling between fear and wonder. I told her it was a tip, nothing more, but the words felt absurd even as I spoke them. Never in all my years of serving had I received such a sum, and I knew deep down it was not a mere act of generosity. That night, long after my siblings had drifted into sleep, and my mother's prayers had faded into silence, I lay awake on the thin mattress in our small room, staring at the cracked ceiling above me. The image of his face would not leave me, the calmness of his eyes, the faint smile on his lips, the strange weight behind his words. "I'll see you soon." I turned those words over and over in my mind until they seemed to echo louder than the ticking of the old clock in the corner. Why would he say that? Why would a man I barely knew promise such a thing? I tried to reason with myself, telling myself that perhaps it had been nothing more than politeness, a phrase spoken without meaning, like so many empty words exchanged between strangers. But no matter how hard I tried, I could not believe it. His voice had carried intention, certainty, as though he truly meant to return, as though his departure was not the end, but merely a pause. And that thought terrified me, because I did not know whether his return would bring blessing or disaster. The money lay in an envelope by my bedside, and each time my eyes closed, I imagined it catching fire, burning holes through the fragile walls of our home. It was a gift, yes, but it was also a question, a riddle I could not solve. Why me? Why not any of the other waiters in the restaurant? Why would a man of such calm strength and quiet mystery take notice of me, a poor servant barely surviving from one day to the next? The more I asked myself, the more restless I became, until sleep was impossible. My mother noticed my silence during dinner, noticed the way I stared too long at the floor, and she asked gently if something was wrong. I wanted to tell her everything, to explain the storm that raged in my chest, but the words stuck in my throat. How could I tell her that a stranger had unsettled me more than years of poverty ever had? How could I explain that his kindness frightened me because it felt too deliberate, too purposeful? Instead, I shook my head, forced a smile, and told her I was only tired. But I was not tired. I was haunted. Haunted by the thought that the money was not just money, but a sign, a symbol of something much larger than I could see. Haunted by the feeling that my life, which had trudged forward in the same rhythm of survival for so long, was standing on the edge of change. Change was something I had dreamed of, prayed for, yet when I felt it stir in the air, I recoiled, afraid of what it might demand of me. The hours stretched into eternity as I lay awake, my thoughts spinning in endless circles. I promised myself that by morning I would let it go, that I would bury the memory of the man, his words, his eyes, and his impossible generosity. I told myself that I could not afford to waste energy on mysteries when survival demanded my full attention. People came and went, customers entered and left, and I had no right to imagine that one of them might hold any significance beyond a fleeting encounter. Yes, that was what I told myself, over and over again, as though repetition could carve truth out of doubt. I would forget him, I would move on, and tomorrow would be just another day. I closed my eyes tightly, clutching the thin blanket around me, whispering those promises into the dark like a prayer. But fate is deaf to such promises, and as I drifted into uneasy half-sleep, I did not know that the very man I was trying so desperately to forget was already preparing to step back into my life, and when he did, nothing I knew would remain the same. When I saw him again, I couldn't believe my eyes. For the man who had walked into the restaurant like a shadow days earlier now arrived with a presence so commanding, so unmistakably powerful, that the very air in the room seemed to shift around him. It was a late evening once again, the restaurant buzzing with the usual chaos of laughter, clinking glasses, and impatient demands. I had fallen back into the rhythm of my work, convincing myself that the stranger with the calm eyes and the mysterious generosity had been nothing more than a fleeting moment in a life filled with forgettable encounters. I told myself I had moved on, though his words still haunted me in the quiet hours of the night. But just as I began to accept that I would never see him again, fate decided to shatter my illusion with a scene so vivid that I will never forget it. The sound of an engine outside the restaurant drew brief attention from the guests, and then the doors opened with a flourish. A luxury car, gleaming under the golden lights of the entrance, had pulled up, and out stepped the very man I thought I had imagined into myth. Except now, he did not walk in unnoticed. Now, he carried the unmistakable aura of wealth and influence, an aura so heavy that it silenced conversations and drew every pair of eyes toward him. Staff members who had ignored him before now rushed forward in a flurry of movement. The manager himself nearly stumbled in his haste to reach the door, his face splitting into an eager smile that I had never once seen directed at me. "Sir, welcome back," he gushed, bowing slightly as though he were greeting royalty. The waiters who usually sneered at me now stood straighter, their eyes wide with recognition, their voices dropping into hushed whispers as they realized who had entered. The whispers spread quickly, carried from table to table until the entire restaurant seemed to pulse with the same revelation. He was no ordinary man. He was no modest guest seeking quiet in the corner. He was a billionaire, a titan of wealth and power whose very name stirred awe in the city. And here I was, the poor waiter who had once served him without knowing, who had spoken to him as though he were just another face in the crowd. My heart sank to the pit of my stomach. A cold wave of dread washed over me, and my hands trembled as I clutched the tray I was carrying. Memories of every word I had spoken to him, every moment of honesty I had shared, every small gesture of respect I had shown came rushing back with a force that nearly knocked the breath out of me. Had I offended him in some way without realizing it? Had my openness, my confessions of struggle and pain, sounded foolish to a man of his stature? The questions stabbed at me relentlessly, each one sharper than the last. All around me, the atmosphere shifted. Guests craned their necks to catch a glimpse of him, their laughter subdued, their eyes filled with envy and admiration. The staff, who so often barked at me for speed, now tripped over themselves to ensure that every detail of his return was perfect. It was as if the entire restaurant had suddenly transformed into a stage designed for him alone, every person playing a part in a performance of reverence and awe. and I stood there, frozen, my pulse hammering in my ears. I remembered his watch, his quiet confidence, his deliberate choice of a modest meal, and now I realized the truth that had been staring me in the face all along. He had been in disguise, hiding in plain sight, and I had been too blinded by exhaustion and doubt to see it. He walked through the restaurant with the same calm stride as before, but now that I knew who he was, that stride looked different. It was not ordinary. It was the walk of a man who knew the ground beneath his feet belonged to him. The walk of someone who had built empires and commanded respect without ever needing to raise his voice. Every guest seemed to shrink slightly in his presence, every staff member bending lower, eager to be noticed, desperate to please. But then something happened that I did not expect. As he reached the center of the hall, where the manager gestured eagerly toward the finest table, he paused. He did not glance at the businessmen who scrambled to greet him, nor did he acknowledge the whispers of admiration that buzzed like electricity around him. Instead, his eyes moved across the room with deliberate slowness until they found me. That gaze stopped me cold. My throat went dry, my knees nearly buckled, and in that moment I wished desperately to vanish into the shadows. Why was he looking at me? Of all the faces in the restaurant, of all the people vying for his attention, why would his eyes seek out mine? The weight of his stare pressed down on me, not with cruelty, but with something else entirely. Something I could not yet name. I stood there clutching the tray, my heart pounding so loudly that I feared everyone around me could hear it. The whispers grew louder, some directed at me now, as though others had noticed the connection between us. Shame and fear twisted in my chest, for I had treated him as though he were ordinary, spoken to him without the deference that others now showered upon him. What if he had returned not out of kindness, but to expose my ignorance, to remind me of my place, to strip me of the fragile dignity I had tried so hard to hold on to? And yet, instead of anger or disdain, he looked straight at me with a calmness that unsettled my very soul, and in that gaze I knew that whatever was about to happen next, it would change everything I thought I knew about my life. My hands trembled as I heard his real identity, because in that single moment the veil was lifted, and the man I had thought of as a quiet stranger, someone ordinary, someone passing, suddenly stood before me as one of the most powerful men in the entire country. The room had fallen into an almost reverent hush. Even the usual laughter of wealthy guests softened into whispers, and I could feel dozens of eyes darting between him and me, curious as to why his attention was fixed so firmly on a poor waiter. My heart pounded against my ribs, my throat dry as sand, and when he finally moved toward me, every step echoed like thunder in my ears. I wanted to flee, to disappear into the shadows of the restaurant, yet my feet remained rooted to the floor, my hands gripping the tray so tightly that my knuckles turned white. He stopped in front of me, his calm expression unchanged, though his presence seemed to fill the entire hall. He spoke my name softly. How he remembered it, I do not know. And then, in a voice that carried the weight of truth, he revealed who he truly was. He was not a simple traveler, not a modest man passing through. He was one of the richest men in the country, a billionaire whose businesses stretched across continents, whose name was spoken in boardrooms and printed on the covers of financial magazines. The revelation struck me like lightning. I could not breathe, could not think, as the pieces fell together in my mind. The watch, the quiet confidence, the way he had studied the room with the eyes of a man who had nothing left to prove. He had not needed the grand clothes or the lavish performance. His power was too deeply rooted to require display. And there I was, trembling before him, realizing I had poured out my life story, my pain, my struggles, to a man whose wealth could erase all of it with the wave of his hand. But he did not look at me with pity, nor with arrogance. Instead, he smiled faintly, almost as though he understood the storm raging inside me, and he began to explain. He told me that he often came in disguise, leaving behind the armor of his wealth and influence, because only then could he see the world for what it truly was. People treated him differently when they thought he was ordinary. Some ignored him, some dismissed him, some revealed their true cruelty. Others, like me, offered honesty and kindness without expectation of reward. He said that those small acts revealed more about human nature than any meeting in a boardroom or any deal signed with ink and paper. His words left me reeling. I struggled to comprehend the enormity of what he was saying, to reconcile the man who had eaten quietly in the corner of the restaurant with the titan whose name held power across nations. My lips parted to speak, but no words came. What could I say? That I was honored? That I was ashamed? That I felt foolish for not recognizing him? Every thought tangled in my mind until I could only stand there, speechless, my chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. And then, as though sensing my turmoil, he continued. He told me that what had impressed him was not my service, not my ability to carry trays or speak politely, but my honesty. He recalled the moment when I had returned his wallet without hesitation, when I could have chosen greed, but instead chose integrity. He said that in a world drowning in lies, deception, and corruption, honesty was rarer than gold, and he valued it more than all the jewels and riches he could buy. Hearing those words shook me to my core. For so long, I had believed that my honesty meant nothing, that my kindness was invisible in a world obsessed with wealth. And yet here was a man who had seen it, who had noticed what others dismissed, who told me it mattered. My eyes burned with tears I tried desperately to hold back because I did not want to break down in front of him, did not want to appear weak in the moment that carried so much weight. I managed to whisper, "I don't understand. Why me?" My voice cracked as the question tumbled out, and it was the only thing I could manage. His gaze softened further, and he replied, "Because you are real. Because when no one is watching, when you believe there is nothing to gain, you still choose to do what is right. That is something money cannot buy, something power cannot create. It is rare, and when I see it, I do not ignore it." Those words echoed in my mind, louder than the whispers of the crowd, louder than the doubts clawing at me. For the first time in years, I felt seen, not as a servant, not as a shadow, but as a man, a human being whose choices mattered. And yet, even as warmth spread through my chest, confusion tangled tightly around it. What did this mean? Why was he telling me all this? What was he leading to? I stood in silence, my hands trembling, my thoughts a whirlwind of disbelief and awe. Around us, the restaurant buzzed with hushed voices, the wealthy elite watching with envy, curiosity, and suspicion. But in that moment, it felt as though the world had shrunk to just the two of us. Me, a poor waiter, and him, a billionaire revealing truths that felt impossible to grasp. And then, just as I thought the night could not hold any more surprises, he leaned closer, his voice lowering so that only I could hear, and made me an offer so extraordinary, so unreal, that for a moment I thought I must be dreaming. My life was about to change forever. Though at that moment, when his words first fell upon my ears, I could not believe that a poor waiter like me, someone invisible to the world, could be standing on the edge of a future that once existed only in my dreams. His eyes never left mine as he spoke, his voice calm, yet carrying a weight that made every syllable feel permanent, unforgettable. "You don't belong here," he said, his tone not unkind, but certain, as though he had already seen a destiny for me that I could not even imagine for myself. "You are not meant to spend your life carrying trays and bowing to people who cannot see your worth. You have something greater, something that cannot be bought." My heart hammered violently, my mind struggling to process his words. He continued, explaining that he wanted to offer me a new job, far better than the endless drudgery of waiting tables. He promised me a place within one of his companies, a position where I would not just survive, but grow, learn, and build a future that could lift me and my family out of the suffocating grip of poverty. At first, I thought I had misheard. That exhaustion was playing tricks on me, but his steady gaze left no room for doubt. I remember shaking my head slightly, disbelief clouding every thought. "Why me?" I whispered, my voice trembling with a mixture of awe and fear. There were thousands of people more educated than me, more skilled, more deserving, or so I thought. But he only smiled, the kind of smile that carried quiet conviction. "Because you have something money cannot buy," he replied firmly. "Integrity. I have built empires. I have seen men rise and fall, and I have learned that talent and intelligence are common, but honesty and sincerity are rare. When you returned my wallet without hesitation, when you spoke to me with truth rather than pretense, you showed me something I value above all else. That is why I am offering this to you, not as charity, but as recognition of who you are." His words struck me deeper than I can ever describe. For years, I had believed that honesty and kindness went unnoticed, that in a world obsessed with wealth and power, my sincerity meant nothing. I had convinced myself that dignity was a luxury I could not afford, that survival required silence, obedience, and invisibility. Yet here was a man whose wealth eclipsed anything I could comprehend, telling me that my integrity was worth more than all the riches he possessed. I felt the world tilt around me. My hands trembled, my breath grew shallow, and for a fleeting moment I truly believed I must be dreaming. The restaurant faded from my awareness. The whispers of guests blurred into silence, and it felt as though only his voice existed, offering me the chance to rewrite my life. He spoke of supporting my education, of ensuring that my siblings had opportunities I had been denied, of giving my mother the peace she deserved after years of struggle. His promises sounded too vast, too generous, too impossible to belong to reality. Tears burned in my eyes, though I tried to hold them back, ashamed to break in front of him. But the weight of his words was too much, the years of struggle pressing against the sudden surge of hope, and I felt my chest tighten with emotions I could not contain. Gratitude, disbelief, fear. They all collided inside me until I could no longer tell one from the other. I looked at him, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I deserve this." The confession slipped out before I could stop it, raw and unpolished, reflecting the truth of how unworthy I felt. He shook his head slowly, his gaze unwavering. "Deserving has nothing to do with it. You earned this the moment you chose honesty over greed, sincerity over deceit. You are not here by accident. You are here because character creates its own destiny, and yours has already begun to reveal itself." His words filled me with a mixture of pride and terror. Pride, because for the first time in my life, someone saw me as more than a shadow. Terror, because I feared that I would fail him, that I would take this opportunity and squander it, proving unworthy of his faith. I felt as though I were standing on a cliff, the world of my old life behind me, the vast unknown stretching endlessly before me. To step forward would mean change, magnificent, terrifying change. To step back would mean safety, the familiar misery I had grown accustomed to. The choice seemed impossible, and yet the very fact that I had a choice at all was staggering. Around us, the restaurant carried on, though I barely noticed. My co-workers watched with wide eyes. The guests whispered furiously. The manager hovered with a nervous smile, but none of it reached me. In that moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my heart and the steady, unshakable voice of the man offering me the key to a new life. I wanted to say yes instantly, to grab the opportunity with both hands, to fall to my knees in gratitude, but something inside me hesitated. Change, no matter how beautiful, carries weight, and I knew that accepting his offer would not simply alter my life, It would redefine it. I would no longer be the man I had been, the poor waiter scraping by. I would become something else entirely, someone I had never dared to imagine I could be. And that thought terrified me as much as it inspired me. As I stood trembling between fear and hope, I realized that the decision I had to make would test me once again. And though his offer sounded like salvation, I knew that accepting it would demand a strength I wasn't sure I possessed. Sometimes life gives you second chances, disguised as ordinary nights, and what began as nothing more than another exhausting shift in a restaurant soon revealed itself as the night that tore down the walls of despair around me and opened the doors to a future I had never dared to imagine. The decision did not come easily, for even as his offer hung in the air like a miracle, my heart wrestled with doubt. Could I truly step away from the life I had known all these years? Could I leave behind the comfort of familiarity, even if that comfort was woven out of struggle and pain? Yet as I stood trembling before him, I realized that fear could no longer dictate my path. To refuse would be to choose the same darkness that had weighed on me for so long, and to accept meant daring to believe in a light that had suddenly, unexpectedly, been placed within my reach. With every ounce of courage I could muster, I nodded, my voice breaking as I whispered the single word that would alter the course of my destiny forever. Yes. The moment the word left my lips, something within me shifted. It was as though the chains I had carried for years loosened, allowing me to breathe with a freedom I had never known. He smiled faintly, not with triumph, but with a quiet satisfaction, as though he had simply been waiting for me to recognize my own worth. And with that acceptance, the life I had been shackled to began to transform, not in a single instant, but slowly, steadily, in ways both small and monumental. The days that followed were filled with change so profound that I often wondered if I was living someone else's story. I traded the worn uniform of a waiter for the crisp attire of an employee in one of his companies. And with that change came a dignity I had long been denied. No longer did I bow endlessly to arrogance or swallow the bitter taste of humiliation. Instead, I was treated with respect, guided by mentors, and given responsibilities that challenged me, pushing me to grow into a man I had always longed to be. He kept every promise he had made. My education, long abandoned in the shadow of poverty, was revived, and I found myself learning not only skills but lessons about the world that expanded my vision beyond survival. My siblings were given opportunities I had once believed impossible. They walked into schools with books and hope instead of worry and despair. My mother, whose weary eyes had carried the weight of unending sacrifice, finally allowed herself to rest, her face softening as the burdens of survival lifted from her frail shoulders. For the first time in years, laughter returned to our small home, not forced or fleeting, but genuine, alive, and filled with the promise of tomorrow. And through it all, I held tightly to the lesson he had gifted me. It was not wealth that had changed me, nor the position I had been offered, but the reminder that honesty and kindness, no matter how small, could reshape destinies. The night I returned his wallet without hesitation, the night I spoke my truth without pretense, I had unknowingly written the first lines of a new chapter. What I once thought of as weakness, the refusal to abandon integrity even in desperation, became the very reason my life transformed. There were moments when I still doubted myself, when the echoes of my old life whispered that I did not belong in this new world. But each time those doubts crept in, I remembered his words. Integrity cannot be bought. And in those moments I stood taller, knowing that I carried within me something that even the richest man could not purchase. My journey from a poor waiter to someone respected did not erase the scars of struggle, nor did it wipe away the memories of hunger and despair. But it gave those memories meaning, turning them into stepping stones rather than chains. I learned that pain, when endured with honesty, becomes strength, and that strength, when recognized, can open doors that once seemed locked forever. As I share this story, I am reminded that fate often hides behind the ordinary, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. A quiet customer? A forgotten wallet? A choice made in the silence of conscience. All of it led to a transformation so profound that even now I sometimes wake in disbelief. And yet it is real, a testament to the truth that no act of honesty is ever wasted, no kindness ever unnoticed. If there is one message I could leave for anyone who hears my story, it is this. One act of integrity can rewrite your entire story. You may think the world doesn't see you, that your struggles are invisible, that your choices carry no weight. But somewhere, somehow, those choices shape a destiny you cannot yet see. I was just a poor waiter serving meals to strangers, yet by choosing honesty over temptation, I unlocked a future I could never have dreamed of. And so, when I look back now, I realize that the night I believed was one of my worst, filled with exhaustion, pain, and endless struggle, was in fact the night that became the beginning of my greatest journey, a journey that continues even today, and one that proves the smallest act of truth can change a life forever. If this story touched your heart, don't just keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs hope today. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss more powerful stories like this one. Drop a comment below and tell me, what does integrity mean to you? And if you believe honesty can still change lives, hit the like button to let the world know.